Proverbs 10:22 says, "The blessing of the Lord makes rich, and he adds no sorrow with it." Ecclesiastes says wealth is meaningless. Jesus warns against storing treasures on earth. So why does the Bible sound like it's arguing with itself about money? If these verses are all true, and they are, then the problem isn't Scripture. The problem is how we've been taught to read it. Most people grow up hearing the same message, repeated in different words. Money is risky. Struggle is spiritual. Debt is unfortunate but normal. And if life feels heavy, that's just part of faith, so you accept it. You pray, you work harder, you try to be grateful while feeling exhausted, and slowly, almost quietly, you begin to believe that pressure is obedience. That belief didn't come from nowhere. It came from sermons that never went deep enough, from verses quoted without context, from translations read quickly, never questioned, never revisited. You've probably heard teachings on this before. Teachings that sounded right, felt humble, and asked you to endure more. And maybe you followed them faithfully, yet nothing really changed. Not inside, not in your finances, not in the weight you carry month after month. So a question forms, one you rarely say out loud. Why does obedience still feel so hard? Here's where everything begins to shift. In Proverbs 10:22, the word translated as sorrow does not mean emotional pain in the original Hebrew. It never did. The word is etzev, and it describes grinding labor, relentless effort, exhaustion that comes from doing things without wisdom. That single word changes the entire verse. Because suddenly the Bible isn't saying God blesses you with wealth and then adds suffering as a lesson. It's saying his blessing removes the kind of painful effort that comes from misalignment. Now the tension starts to resolve. Jesus wasn't condemning provision. He was warning against false security. Ecclesiastes wasn't attacking wealth. It was exposing wealth without purpose. And Proverbs wasn't promising money. It was revealing a pattern most people never see because it's buried under tradition. This is where discomfort begins. Because if struggle isn't holiness, if debt isn't virtue, then maybe what's been normalized isn't faith, it's misunderstanding. Once you notice this, you can't unsee it. You start recognizing the same pattern in Joseph's rise, where wisdom replaced survival, in Solomon's reign, where insight mattered more than effort, even in the way Jesus spoke about stewardship, not poverty. This isn't a shortcut, it isn't a formula, and it isn't about money in the way you think, it's about alignment. And once you see this pattern clearly, you'll never read this verse or your own situation the same way again. Stay with me. Because what comes next challenges something you may have believed your entire life. If you're the kind of person who doesn't settle for surface-level answers, someone who wants to understand Scripture beyond what's usually taught, pause for a second and press like. Not because I asked, but because it tells this platform that deeper conversations still matter. It helps this reach others who are quietly searching for clarity, not noise. Now let's keep going, because the real pattern starts to emerge here. Joseph was 17 when his life collapsed. One moment, he was the favored son with a future. The next, he was betrayed by his own brothers, sold like property, and dragged into a foreign land where his name, language, and God meant nothing. By the time we usually meet Joseph in sermons, he's already successful, already elevated, already blessed. But Scripture doesn't rush past the tension. Genesis tells us Joseph spent years doing everything right and watching everything go wrong. He worked faithfully in Potiphar's house. He honored God in private. And still, he ended up falsely accused and thrown into prison. This is the part most people quietly relate to, because many believers know what it's like to obey God and still feel buried, to pray and still feel forgotten, to work honestly and still struggle financially. And this is usually where a familiar verse gets misused. Deuteronomy 8:18 says, "Remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the power to get wealth." Most people hear that verse and assume it means effort, grinding harder, trying longer, enduring more. But the Hebrew word translated as power is coach. And coach does not mean physical strength, it does not mean hustle, it does not mean exhaustion. Coach means capacity, wisdom-enabled ability, and alignment with function. That distinction matters. Because Joseph did not rise out of prison by working harder than everyone else. He rose because he understood something others didn't. When Pharaoh summoned Joseph, it wasn't for labor, it was for interpretation. Genesis 41 records that moment carefully. Joseph listens, discerns patterns, and then offers a strategy so precise that Pharaoh immediately recognizes its source. Can we find anyone like this man, Pharaoh says, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Genesis 41:38. Joseph is elevated not because he suffered long enough, but because he aligned with wisdom. Here's what archaeology quietly confirms. Ancient Near Eastern records show that Egypt was obsessed with dream interpretation, but nearly all interpretations were symbolic guesses. Joseph's explanation was different. It was structured, economic, forward-looking. He wasn't just spiritual. He was strategic. This is the part modern teaching often skips. Joseph didn't reject provision to stay holy. He didn't fear administration as unspiritual. He didn't confuse survival with virtue. He stored grain. He created reserves. He managed abundance so future famine wouldn't destroy an entire nation, and Scripture never rebukes him for that. Instead, it says, Joseph stored up grain in great abundance until he stopped measuring it, for it was beyond measure. Genesis 41:49. That verse makes people uncomfortable because it challenges the idea that holiness requires scarcity. It reveals a pattern where wisdom produces provision without grinding toil, and this is where the modern misinterpretation becomes costly. Many people read Deuteronomy 8:18 and assume God blesses effort. He doesn't. He blesses alignment. Joseph's life shows that wealth in Scripture isn't about chasing money or avoiding it. It's about operating in the role God designed you for, without fear. When that alignment clicks, effort changes, prayer changes, work changes. You stop praying to escape pressure. You start praying for clarity. You stop working harder out of fear. You start working differently out of wisdom. This is why some people pray constantly and stay stuck, and others move once and everything shifts. Joseph didn't break debt with faith alone. He broke it with understanding. And once you see this pattern, you realize something unsettling. You've probably believed this verse said God rewards struggle. It never did. The tension most people feel about money and faith doesn't come from rebellion. It comes from confusion. Because when you open the Bible, you don't find a single simple message about wealth. You find verses that seem to pull in opposite directions. Jesus says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth." Paul warns that the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Ecclesiastes calls riches meaningless, yet the same scriptures describe Abraham as extremely wealthy, David as a king with vast resources, Solomon as the richest man of his era, blessed by God himself. So what are we supposed to believe? Most people resolve this tension the wrong way. They assume faith and provision are enemies, that humility requires limitation, that safety lies in having less, not more. And when life feels financially heavy, they don't question the framework. They question themselves. But this isn't a faith problem. It's a context problem. Jesus was not condemning provision. He was confronting where trust lives. Paul was not attacking wealth. He was exposing what controls the heart. Ecclesiastes was not glorifying poverty. It was revealing the emptiness of accumulation without purpose. Once you understand that, the contradiction begins to dissolve. Because the Bible never teaches scarcity as virtue, it teaches stewardship as responsibility. And when you step back far enough, a pattern appears, one that spans cultures, covenants, and callings. Solomon understood this pattern clearly. When God offered him anything he wanted, Solomon didn't ask for money. He asked for wisdom, not because wealth was evil, but because wisdom governs wealth. And Scripture says that wisdom produced provision so vast it became legendary. Silver became as common as stones. Kings came to learn how Solomon managed what he had been entrusted with. Paul followed the same pattern. He made tents, not because ministry required poverty, but because dependence distorts calling. He refused to be a burden, not because provision was wrong, but because freedom mattered. Paul understood that when your mission is clear, money becomes a tool, not a master. Then there's Lydia. Acts 16 introduces her almost casually, a seller of purple cloth. That phrase doesn't sound dramatic, but historically it meant wealth, influence, and access. Purple dye was rare, expensive, connected to royalty. Lydia was already successful before hearing Paul speak, and Scripture never asks her to abandon her business to prove her faith. Instead, her resources become a doorway for the early church. Provision didn't corrupt her calling, it amplified it. Even Jesus himself followed this pattern. He never pursued wealth, but he also never feared it. He accepted support. He multiplied resources when needed. He managed shared funds through a treasurer. And when he spoke about money, his warnings were always about attachment, not possession. Here's what these lives have in common: Abraham, Joseph, Solomon, Lydia, Paul, even Jesus. None of them worshipped money, none of them feared provision, and none of them confused struggle with righteousness. They understood something tradition often hides. God's economy is not about accumulation or abstinence. It's about alignment. When purpose is clear, provision follows order. When order is present, effort becomes effective. And when effort aligns with wisdom, pressure lifts. This is where modern life collides with ancient truth. Entrepreneurs burn out not because they're ungodly, but because they chase outcomes without alignment. Missionaries struggle not because provision is forbidden, but because systems matter. Professionals stay stuck not because God is withholding, but because clarity is missing. The Bible doesn't contradict itself about money. It reveals a consistent pattern that only becomes visible when you stop reading isolated verses and start tracing lives. Solomon, Paul, Lydia, and even Jesus were not teaching different messages. They were teaching the same truth from different angles, but it's buried under tradition. There's a moment in every journey where information stops helping and honesty starts doing the work. This is that moment, because everything we've talked about so far sounds reasonable until it lands on you. Not on theology, not on doctrine, on your real life. So let me ask you something slowly. Are you afraid of prospering because somewhere along the way you were taught that it feels unspiritual? Not afraid of money itself, but afraid of what it might say about you. Afraid of being judged. Afraid of drifting. Afraid that ease might mean compromise. Have you confused wisdom with fear? Because there's a difference. Fear says, don't move, don't risk, don't grow. Wisdom says, understand the season, act with clarity. Yet many people call fear humility and call stagnation obedience. Does your money serve purpose or do you serve it? Be honest. Do you feel controlled by numbers, deadlines, bills, the quiet anxiety that follows you even on days when nothing is technically wrong? If provision was meant to be a tool, when did it become a weight? Here's where this gets uncomfortable. Some people stay financially stuck not because God is withholding, but because staying small feels safer than standing responsible. Responsibility exposes alignment, and alignment removes excuses. When Joseph rose, he didn't just gain authority, he gained accountability. When Lydia opened her home, she didn't just offer hospitality, she funded a movement. When Solomon asked for wisdom, he didn't escape pressure, he inherited decisions. Prosperity doesn't remove responsibility, it reveals it. That's why this conversation triggers resistance. Because if provision isn't the enemy, then delay isn't always spiritual, and waiting isn't always obedience. Sometimes waiting is fear dressed up as faith. Let me ask you another question. Have you ever prayed for breakthrough, but avoided clarity? Have you asked God to fix things, while quietly resisting the changes that understanding would demand? Because wisdom costs something. It costs old beliefs, it costs familiar struggle, it costs the comfort of saying, this is just how life is. And once wisdom arrives, you can't unsee it. You can't keep blaming systems. You can't keep spiritualizing pressure. You can't keep pretending confusion is humility. This is why Jesus said, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Not comfort you, not flatter you, free you. Freedom isn't passive. Freedom is aligned action. So I want to hear from you, not as an audience, but as a person. Let me ask you, which of these questions hit you hardest? Are you afraid of prospering because it feels unspiritual? Have you confused wisdom with fear? Does your money serve purpose, or do you serve it? Drop a comment. I actually read them, and it's how I choose what we go deeper into next, because the pattern only works when it becomes personal. If you're still here, you're not casual. Most people would have clicked away by now. Most people are comfortable with surface answers and familiar explanations, but you stayed. And that tells me something about you. You're not just looking for relief, you're looking for understanding. You're someone who senses that Scripture holds more depth than what's usually presented, and you're willing to sit with the tension long enough to uncover it. That's rare. What we've seen in this journey isn't a new belief system, it's a correction. We saw that the Bible doesn't contradict itself about money. It reveals a pattern, one that only appears when you stop isolating verses and start tracing lives. Joseph didn't rise because he endured long enough. He rose because wisdom replaced confusion. Solomon didn't receive provision because he chased wealth. He received it because he asked for understanding. Lydia didn't lose her calling when she prospered. Her provision became the platform that carried the message forward. And even Jesus never taught fear of provision. He warned against misplaced trust. The common thread isn't money, it's alignment. When alignment is missing, effort becomes exhausting, prayer becomes heavy, and life feels like constant resistance. But when alignment clicks, something shifts. Work changes, decisions change. Even faith feels lighter because it's no longer fighting misunderstanding. If this stirred something in you, that's not accidental. It means you're beginning to recognize a pattern that most people never slow down enough to see. A pattern hidden, not because it was forbidden, but because it requires maturity to handle. And here's the part that deserves honesty. What we uncovered today is only the foundation, because there is another verse, one that has been used for generations to spiritualize poverty, delay, and limitation. A verse quoted to justify staying small, a verse often presented as proof that God prefers lack. But when you read it in its original language, when you examine its historical context, when you compare it with the lives of those God entrusted with influence, that interpretation begins to collapse. In the next video, we're going to confront that verse directly. Not emotionally, not defensively, but carefully. We're going to look at what it actually says, why it's been taught the way it has, and what changes when you understand it through the lens of God's economy instead of the world system. If you thought today challenged assumptions, the next step goes even deeper. So don't treat this as a one-off video. This is a journey. And if you're willing to keep digging, what you discover next may redefine how you see provision, purpose, and responsibility altogether. I'll see you in the next one. If this brought clarity, if it challenged something you've believed for a long time, then subscribe. Not for notifications, not for numbers. This isn't just a channel. It's a growing group of people who are done with shallow faith, recycled answers, and surface-level scripture. We don't rush here. We don't simplify what was meant to be understood deeply, and we don't walk this journey alone. If you're ready to keep digging, to question respectfully, and to align faith with understanding, you're in the right place. Subscribe and walk this path with us.